All right, hello and welcome. This is Understanding the Progressive Era. We're going to try to start to answer that question of what do we want to be. Let's get started. A couple of questions to consider for this video. First of all, what do we want to be? It's something we've been talking about in class here. Obviously, this is a period of self-reflection and change that follows industrialization and urbanization, so we'll see some major changes coming. But another question that's kind of new for today is, what do you think? Do you think the progressive era should be considered a liberal movement or a conservative movement? And we'll return to this point at the end of the video. All right, key point number one here. There is a realization during the progressive era that America was not perfect and that it can be improved upon. And while that might sound silly, I think it's worth mentioning that there was a strong sense of nationalism that did accompany the beginning of the imperialist movement. Obviously, that's going to be challenged, especially after the acquisition of the Philippines and the Filipino Insurrection. But clearly, the days of Washington are long gone. When I talk about Washington, I wanted to include this. We think of him as like the model American citizen. He was honest. He's a gentleman who could dance and sword fight. Obviously, he's a military leader committed to the cause and full of bravery. He was the reluctant politician, that traditional disinterested politician that didn't really want to serve but had the office thrust upon him by his peers. He led by example in the field and in office, and his farewell address is a good example of that. He then retired to his plantation with honor and rode off into the sunset. So compare that to, well, here's a picture of that, a stamp, I think that was honoring the cherry tree myth, of course, that we know about George Washington, showing his honesty. But compare that to political parties that emerged under the new Constitution and the changes that we can see there just alone. We have campaigning that emerges, such as Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, as you can see here, and a great deal of mudslinging that came with that. Speaking of Jackson, he and John Quincy in the election of 1828, right, which resulted in the corrupt bargain, of course. But in that, there was literal insults of one another's wives being thrown around. We also see partisan action taking place, whether it's political parties today digging their heels in, refusing to compromise or listen, or the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which essentially tried to silence the new Democratic Republicans. And of course, if you don't believe me that the days of Washington are long gone, we could talk about the Gilded Age, which was full of corruption at the federal level, in Congress with credit mobilier, with the president and the whiskey ring, the state levels, municipal levels, such as the boss politics, as you see on the right here, the boss Tweed. Corruption was wild. It's also kind of a single-party era. The Republicans certainly dominated the federal government, at least the presidency, from the Reconstruction period up through McKinley. So with that realization that America was not perfect comes the idea that change can improve upon American society and the country at large. And so that change is rooted in traditional American values such as equality and justice, as you can see here. And while there have already been attempts to extend equality through Reconstruction, for example, we now see justice as being applied to an economic sense. So, for example, sort of regulating unregulated capitalism in a way to bring ethics into business. Another point to think about would be that progress can be attained through government involvement, action, and regulation. And throughout the first semester, we discussed debates in the role and power of government. Should we have a loose interpretation of the Constitution, or should we have a strict interpretation of the Constitution, for example? Can the U.S. government make a Bank of the United States? A good example of the government making changes or promoting change through its action. Obviously, you can see FDR here in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you probably know that during the New Deal, he's going to take major action and have a major role in the American economy. And after that, we start to see economic regulation and protection as a responsibility of the federal government. The progressive era leads to similar ideas being circulated amongst the American people and similar actions being taken by the federal government. Good thing to think about with continuity and change, or perhaps a bit of both, is this idea that the role of the government was growing from the beginning. And that is true. Think about the Constitution versus the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were obviously very weak and it lacked power to tax and didn't have an army and so forth. And so we see a major shift of that power consolidation of power under the U.S. Constitution. That's that question we looked at first semester of who's in charge, sort of like as power is brought from the extremities to the central government. How about 1803 with John Marshall? And I don't want to say the invention of judicial review, but the creation of a power that made the third branch of government really equal to the other two. Similarly, Hamilton's financial plan and Clay's American system sought to facilitate the growth, development, and change of the American economy and really the country as a whole as a result of that. Also, you could make a similar argument about westward expansion and growth, whether it was buying Louisiana, as Jefferson did, or the Homestead Act in 1862, or the fact that 5 times as much land was given to railroad companies in order to promote this westward growth. We knew, as a country, we knew there's resources there, and we knew that those resources would lead to more continued growth and opportunity. How about the government easing sectional tension through a series of compromises? Again, that's not in the Constitution either, but the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and even the Kansas-Nebraska Act are actions that were hopefully trying to solve tension that was related to sectionalism. And if and when that sectional tension erupted, the government used its power to restore order and then project itself forward through Reconstruction. We see sort of the reshaping or the attempt at reshaping the South in a more northern Republican way of doing business. So just to reiterate, the role of the government had changed or had been expanding since the beginning. And the progressive era was no different. Collective action would bring issues to the table that could never again be ignored. Once we start to talk about the need to solve problems, the problem itself may be solved, whether in this case you see working conditions, but the concept of making a more perfect situation or improving upon ourselves will not go away. Collective action took the form, as you can see, of labor unions here, or perhaps popular political parties like the Populists in the West. Another point to think about is that the progressive movement was led by middle-class Americans, and they really enlightened the rest of us as to the inequalities that existed in American life. As I said in class today, the immigrant from Lithuania who worked in the factory and lived in the tenement was either blind to how bad that was or unable for a variety of reasons to make any sort of significant change. It was the wealthier, the middle class population that had a position of influence and the means to make change. So you could look at Jacob Riis and his How the Other Half Lives and how that exposed the truth of tenement life, or the efforts of Jane Addams and the settlement house movement with her Hull House about helping people in times of need. Something I want to think about here briefly is this concept of liberty versus equality. And a lot of times we use this interchangeably, but it's not necessarily the same term. When I hear liberty, I think about the removal of barriers, sort of the right that you have to your rights, and the idea or the concept that no one can infringe upon your rights. But at the end of the day, you are still responsible for yourself, and in many ways this parallels that Horatio Alger myth. And so when I hear equality, I usually think about the extension of equality by a governing body. And there was, of course, a realization that there were, in fact, barriers that were created which resulted in the unequal situation and opportunity for some. The example you can see here would be unregulated capitalism, which let talented entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie to make more money than you and I can comprehend. They were very good at what they did, and they were not necessarily violating laws. Profit was driving their decision. But the result of that was A, the monopolization of capital by the few, and B, deplorable living conditions for the rest of us. And so the federal government did try to fix that situation in the mid-19th century with the Interstate Commerce Act, in the late 19th century with the Sherman Antitrust Act. And those were all sort of steps in the right direction in protecting individuals and promoting equality or creating opportunity for the rest of us. But it wasn't until 1914 with the Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, that we see any real weight to that legislation. So again, this progressive era in many ways is a continuation of things that had been already happening. You could pause this if you'd like, but this is the little chart that I took from a textbook. You can see sort of the impact of industry in cities, and the creation of problems. And while the problems are not listed there, the solutions, the effects are below. And so, for example, if you look at the social effects of the progressive movement, we start to see laws that protect workers, whether it's wages, conditions, or hours. And the good thing to fall back on might be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which there were no building codes and safety codes to protect the workers who unfortunately perished in that tragedy. Little timeline to wrap things up here to see how the pendulum shifts in the American political sort of mind frame. If you look at imperialism in the late 19th century, whether you think about the Indian Wars as an example of early imperialism, or even Manifest Destiny for that matter, but really the Spanish-American War and victory there, the acquisition of the Philippines and the Filipino Insurrection, and the response to that with the Anti-Imperialist League, who began to really question the true motives of American growth and American influence abroad. That runs to about the turn of the century, and we have this progressive wave really take hold of the reins. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at that, that progressive mentality or the emphasis on progressivism actually begins to subside as World War I begins. You may know the U.S. was neutral initially, but also heavily involved financially as well. Following World War I, though, as we have a united front for the war effort, all people are involved in this war effort, men, women, all various ethnicities, immigrants, and otherwise various races and so forth. And so that sort of paves the way for this much more liberal sort of lifestyle that is the Roaring Twenties, and we'll come back to that soon enough. Just to wrap things up, those two questions again. First of all, what do we want to be? What type of nation do we want to be? And this period of self-reflection is going to be a chance for us to look at ourselves and make changes and for the positive outcome that we hope to have. The second question, though, and hopefully we can talk about this more in class, is whether or not the progressive era itself was a liberal movement or a conservative movement. I truly believe you can make a case either way. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped. If you have any questions, please post them below. Feel free to email. Take care.